The following presentation is part of the Technology and the Corporation Conference Series, sponsored by MIT's Industrial Liaison Program.
Hi, morning. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about transparency, specifically supply chain transparency. For the better part of 10 years, I've been working on this issue from when it was kind of a fringe topic to something that's growing to be more and more part of business as usual. And I'll try to make this fun too. So starting with about 10 years ago, the state of supply chain transparency, what does transparency actually look like? It's not always the same, and it's not evenly distributed. This was one of the pieces of consumer communications that really prompted me to look into this topic much more. So take about 8 years ago, I think you all probably had one of these when Mac introduced the first aluminum computers, and they advertised them as the greenest in the world. And I was an engineering student here at the Media Lab, and I thought, you know, there must be something more than just being the greenest in the world. There must be some numbers or some facts or some metric that I can use to actually know. And this is really the turning point. So about 8-9 years ago, social media, crowdsourcing, publishing platforms had really made it possible for anyone to learn way more than what brands were communicating through things like billboards. And so I decided to just dive right in and spend the better part of 10 years doing that. First thing I did was basically look up what a computer is made of and say, okay, turns out all of those things in white are inside a computer. And that's pretty mind-blowing and kind of beautiful in a scary way. And then I said, okay, well, you know, they just released this thing called Google Earth. Maybe I can look up where these minerals all come from and just zoom in and at least check it out. And that was fine. So about half the tin in the world, for example, comes from that little island off the coast of Bangka, Indonesia. It's been the source of half the tin in the world for about 200 years. And so in your cell phone, in your laptop, there's about 100 grams of tin from that island. Pretty cool. And then you can dig further, right? Social media. So say, okay, I want to see videos that have been shot on that island. I'm sure, you know, there's something pretty gorgeous going on there. Oh, geez. Search tin mining Bangka Island, and you find videos just like this. Basically, people working in mud. Turns out it's illegal to mine tin on Bangka Island. It's done entirely by informal, what are called artisanal miners, working in these kinds of conditions. I thought, oh, this is weird. You know, I took basically a week of research, and all of a sudden I'm in this muddy pit in Indonesia. What else can I find? All right, well, Greenpeace decided to start publishing a guide that ranked all the computer makers based on which one was the greenest. I thought, huh. So this didn't take me that long to become completely confused. In fact, I wasn't the only one. They were ultimately sued for that ad campaign. Greenpeace went further, and this was really the state of supply chain transparency back then, was that you had to really fight to get it. And this is just a fun video to watch for nostalgia's sake.
Morning. Let's take a look at a revolutionary phone. We want to reinvent the phone. And we are calling it iPhone.
What we're going to be doing today is dismantling this iPhone so that we can get at the internal components. Electronics companies have traditionally relied on the cool, clean image of their devices in order to sell them. What we found over the years is that once you get behind that shiny cover, the story can be very different.
Yuck!
So that was fun, right? Seeing that old iPhone. So those other companies are doing great, by the way. I don't know if you noticed. The ones that had better standards have all stopped making phones. So they launched a campaign, and this was really the dynamic, right, at the time. So they launched a campaign. It went viral. They actually won awards and actually pushed Apple to start to do something pretty radical, which was publish what every one of their products was made of and what the impact was, at least in terms of global warming potential. So I said, okay, there's a methodology, both kind of a PR methodology and a scientific methodology to measure the impact of products. So I built a little software tool here at the lab, which was just meant to do that, just to allow anyone who was interested to measure the environmental impact of a product based on where the various components came from. Okay? And I called it SourceMap, and that's the company that I started a few years later. And the idea was just that, you know, if you wanted to know the impact of something, you had a right to find out. And the only way you could find out is if you knew what it was made of and where those parts came from. So we had this very innocuous tool, and I didn't even know what a supply chain was at the time, but I found out soon enough. So I grew up in the 90s, and in the 90s you had this Life magazine article came out, and it really devastated this one brand name called Nike, I think to the tune of billions in sort of brand reputation. A lot of millennials will know about an event that happened in Dhaka in Bangladesh, 3 years ago, the collapse of a big factory that also made apparel. And in all these cases, you had this impression that, you know, somebody just had to stumble upon a catastrophe or disaster in a supply chain for anyone to ever find out. It's almost archaeological. And this set up a dynamic or kind of the idea in people's minds that basically companies are out there hiding terrible practices in supply chains, and it's going to take NGOs, it's going to take activists to find out. It's the idea of the conscious consumer, right? The consumer who votes with their dollars and picks a product based on the reputation and the social and the environmental impact. And so my friend James Patton in 2003 created, actually, before any of this technology existed, the perfect tool for the conscious consumer. This one is also funny.
Hi, I'm Raphael, and today I'm going to tell you about a revolutionary product that could change your life. When you go shopping, do you wish you knew more about the companies that made the foods you buy? Well, now you can with a device that'll tell you the real truth. It's called the Swipe and Gripe 3000. It's the latest in our line of corporate fallout detectors, and it uses the latest technology that has just become available to the general public. You bring it with you when you shop, and it helps you decide what to buy.
I've been using the Swipe and Gripe for about 3 months now, and it's really changed the way I shop. The way it works is you scan a product, and the machine makes noise if the company that makes it does bad things. That way, I can tell that I'm shopping for the best product for my family.
The Swipe and Gripe is easy to use. Just turn it on and swipe an item. The Swipe and Gripe comes with sensitivity controls. Are you an environmentalist? Just flip the switch like this. Think a sweatshop here or there is okay? Just turn down the sensitivity knob a bit. The Swipe and Gripe cares about what's important to you.
Okay, that keeps going and it gets better. But this was really the dynamic, right? This was the idea, was that there was some sort of a good and evil. And there's been a lot of groundswell and a kind of ground up resistance even more recently. So things like Fashion Revolution is an organization that came about just after Rana Plaza, specifically to give a voice to conscious consumers that wanted to ask brands, you know, who made my clothes? Where do my clothes come from? And be sure that they weren't sponsoring or in any way contributing to the shoddy conditions that led to Rana Plaza. And more recently, I don't know if some of you have heard about this campaign. It was launched by, I think, a teenager who was Googling, just like I started, Googling the ingredients in a Gatorade bottle and found that, just like in the iPhone 2007, there's bromine in Gatorade. And she started a campaign, and this ingredient, brominated vegetable oil, had been banned in Europe for quite a while. And with the petition on change.org, she was able to change. So this idea of the conscious and engaged and activist consumer really underscores the beginning of supply chain transparency. And so I decided that we would take that little carbon footprint mapping tool and we would just turn it into an online platform where anybody could out anyone about any supply chain practices. We would tell the story, all the factories, all the mines, all the farms, and really combine all that data that we had been sort of ad hoc pulling together into a central database that was publicly available. And you know, the first few sponsors of the software that saw this demo at the Media Lab said, "Oh, that's pretty amazing. Do you have my supply chain in there?" And that's when I realized something very strange. So two things we realized right away. One, that story about sort of consumers fighting against brands was a little bit superficial. On the one hand, there were a ton of businesses that wanted to be transparent about their supply chain. So it started with a friend of mine who's a chef, and he was doing that local buying thing, and you always see locally sourced whenever possible at the bottom of a menu. And he was really fed up with that because he said, you know, it's not possible to locally source that much stuff in Boston in February. And I'm going to show you exactly what I'm sourcing locally and what I'm not sourcing locally, and enough with this sort of blanket statement. So he came to me and said, I want to use your mapping software, but not to, you know, investigate supply chain problems, but to promote a conscious supply chain, and to be able to also promote, you know, when choices have to be made one way or another, to basically give transparency. You know, the website was up for about a month when it got picked up by the Huffington Post, and then all of a sudden we had something like 10,000 supply chain maps. And very interestingly, a lot of them were actually published by companies, and companies that don't necessarily get identified as being particularly transparent. So Chiquita published their entire supply chain from farm to distribution center one day. I logged in and said, well, that's really amazing. And then they explained, you know, for various sites why they chose them and how they ship slowly and why these plantations are being done in a careful way. And so we saw this, on the one hand, brands are being transparent. And by the way, there was always the idea that you would be able to scan that product in the store and find out where it comes from. We actually got sponsored by a brand called Stonyfield up here in New Hampshire that actually belongs to Danone. And they've worked so long with their suppliers, they make organic yogurt, that they have long-standing relationships with all of them, including videos and photos and stories and personal relationships. And so they said, look, help us make a map. And they, of course, branded it in a way that made sense for them, but basically the idea was that it would go viral. And not just their practices going viral, but also the practices of their suppliers. And so the suppliers got promoted in the process. Now, we weren't the only ones doing this, right? Patagonia, 2007, published the first supply chain transparency website that's well known. And they would do what Robert did, which is tell you the good parts of each product and the bad parts, right? They weren't just telling you that it was the greenest down sweater in the world. Companies like Chipotle have been famous for doing this. Nike came out with a manufacturing map not long ago. And supply chains aren't the only thing that brands are being radically transparent about, right? They can be transparent about pricing, formulations, the kinds of certifications and contracts that they enforce. This is actually a brand called Honest Buy that not only tells you exactly what every piece of clothing you buy from them is made of, it actually breaks down the price of every piece, the price paid and the margin. So this is one of the more radical, you see there, the euros and how much the retail markup was, et cetera, et cetera. Intel actually published its supply chain map in 2005, and they have some pretty radical transparency around their factories. In fact, you can read the emissions coming out of the smokestacks at every Intel chip fab in the world in real time and see how it's improving over the years. I'm not sure anyone knows that that's the case, but it's a mind-blowing amount of data that's automatically kept up to date. So a lot of brands, in short, were already doing supply chain transparency. But a lot of brands weren't. And that was the other learning that we had from making the software. This is a little gizmo called an oxygen sensor. It's in every engine, every gasoline engine in the world. All of the oxygen sensors in the world, well, 80% of them were made by a Hitachi plant in the east of Japan. And about 2 weeks after the tsunami hit Japan in 2011, this GM factory in Louisiana shut down completely because they had run out of their inventory of oxygen sensors. And even though the oxygen sensor is $1, you need it to run the engine to know how much air to burn. And so you had plants, GM plants, Volkswagen plants, Mercedes plants, all over the world shutting down fully 2 weeks after the tsunami because they ran out of those parts, but most importantly because they didn't know that their parts came from Japan, which is a pretty crazy thing. And this has happened, repeatedly, right, in the last 10 years. As products get more complex and supply chains get leaner, it starts to come out that a lot of companies are not really keeping track of that whole supply network that they rely on. Almost all the hard drives in the world were made in Thailand until a flood in 2012 destroyed all those factories. I don't know if you remember when laptops were like this thick and then they became this thick. It was more or less because the world's supply of spinning hard drives just dried up that day, and there was a room in the market all of a sudden for solid-state drives to dominate. And so it shifted the entire industry from one technology to another. And that was a flood, and it was mostly because nobody realized that they had concentrated all their supply to one city. Obviously, there's some tragic consequences to not knowing when there's adulteration in a supply chain. Heparin is actually an injectable drug, a blood thinner that's widely used, and it is based on an extract of pork. And at the same time as pork prices had tripled, heparin prices had not changed. It turns out they had substituted that extract for something synthetic. A bunch of people died as a result. You see this in the news all the time. If you go to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, children's toys ending up with tons of cadmium and lead in them because, again, nobody's really keeping track of where those metals came from. So at the same time as we saw some brands really embracing supply chain transparency, we saw very large industries that just didn't even seem to be able to respond in time when something happened halfway around the world. And so I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to go much farther and basically help companies find out what they know. And actually in a project down the street with the Center for Transportation and Logistics, we got access to some of the big CPG databases, and what we saw was this. Right, if you're a big factory in some developed part of the world, you essentially see yourself in the middle. Laser's not working. And you see your distribution centers, your customers to the right, and you see your suppliers to the left. And so this is like the world before social media, when you had a Rolodex and a phone. But you could never know who knew the people in your Rolodex. And if you map a real supply chain, it has a tendency to look a little bit more like this. This is actually a real supply chain, which is to say there are many, many tiers of supply and many, many suppliers in those tiers. And if you only know your direct distributors, you may not even know where this stuff is made, and you don't know who their suppliers are, and you don't know who their suppliers are. And when you're dealing with food, apparel, if you go down to the farm level, you could be talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of producers in your supply chain. So luckily, right, social media had just come about. The idea that you could have 100,000 or 1 million people communicating in real time from halfway around the world was banal. The problem was not for supply chain managers. This is one of the sort of bulbs that went off that led us to our current approach. I don't know if you recognize this picture, but on I think it was October 29th, 2012, Sandy hits New York City. And that black part of Manhattan below 14th Street, that was essentially had all been washed over by a saltwater wave. That salt water also uprooted a lot of those big oil tanks on the New Jersey coast in Elizabeth that hold all the oil that feeds all the airports and all the cars and all the ambulances and all the police cars in New York City. For about 8 days, no fuel came into New York City. It's a city that drinks about 500,000 barrels a day via pipeline direct from Houston. And that flow stopped, and it was all panic broke out. And how did the city get supplies of oil for ambulances and repair vehicles and police? Well, they didn't do it because they had a social network to talk with all their suppliers and find out. They actually had to get on the phone and start dialing until this website called gasbuddy.com called the Economic Development Corporation in New York City and said, listen, we have this crowdsourced app where people put in gas prices so that you know which gas station to go to get the cheapest gas. We can give you access to our database, and you can see which gas stations are actually not just the prices, but also which ones have any fuel at all. And so for a brief period of time, the biggest city in the hemisphere, or at least in the US, was relying on a gas price app to keep food and pharmaceuticals and fuel going in this mega metropolis of 9 million until they finally commandeered, I think it was a fuel train from Boston to start bringing fuel back into the city on a regular basis. So here was a real insight, right? There's a crowdsourcing potential, not just to help all of us post pictures of our lunch online, but also to really keep supply chains connected and working. So we went and we said, okay, what's the hardest supply chain to track? It's probably cotton, because you have something like 20 million cotton farmers in the world. And we said, okay, well, if we go to the hardest one and we go to the places where there's the least connectivity and we can make supply chain transparency work there, then we can probably do it anywhere else. And this was actually a project out of Orissa, so eastern India. And no matter where we went, even if there wasn't internet, somebody had a cell phone. And so we knew that these supply chains were completely broken because farmers are continuously getting paid too little, and there's no evidence of who they sold to, and every day they're waiting for a better offer. And we said, no, look, there's phones, there's connectivity, there's SMS. We can do this. We can extend our social network that far, and so there's no excuse to not know where things come from. A friend of mine who was studying at Sloan had just gotten a job at Mars Chocolate, and she had seen me talk about SourceMap, and she said, look, we have a problem at Mars, which is this. The problem is that there's a cocoa deficit. There's a tragic shortage of cocoa around the world, and the projections have all borne out. I think the price has tripled now in the last 5 years of raw cocoa bean, and there's a lot of reasons. I can't believe you're not more. There's no tears or like, okay. But climate change, you name it, the conflict, epidemics. There's been all sorts of things that have affected the cocoa growing areas of the world. And she said, look, we have no visibility into these farms. We're a candy company with factories in New Jersey. We don't buy in West Africa. We have some projects on the ground there. In fact, what she did, she went to visit the farms as part of their sustainability work. And this was Shayna. And she gave out her card. And she got back to Chicago, where she was based at the time. And she got a Facebook message from one of the cocoa farmers that she had given a card to in Cote d'Ivoire. And she realized, well, we've been using PDFs and annual corporate responsibility reports to find out how conditions are in cocoa farms. And I've got a Facebook friend who is a cocoa farmer. Why are we going through these circuitous ways? Why don't we just build a social network that connects us directly with the farms? And so that's what she asked us to do. We basically said, look, some tablets in the hands of some extension agents, and every time they go visit a farm, they capture information on the yields and the techniques they're using to grow cocoa, and on how many children there are and whether they're attending school. Just try to get a picture of the social environmental conditions that are leading to the shortage so that they can have big data to drive engagement and the kinds of resources like distributing fertilizer that are shown to improve yields and restore the soil. And so all that data from all those little tablets feeds a dashboard that's actually used in real time by managers around the world now to collect data from about 100,000 smallholder farmers, South America, West Africa, and Indonesia. So this was a real shift. So this is no longer about consumers at all. If you totally switch the discussion here. This is about producers and the real benefit to operations from having transparency in the supply chain. Now we've gone in this direction heavily because we saw that actually buyers were driving transparency more than marketing. Okay, so for about 3 years, all we did was help purchase at SourceMap was help companies do this kind of traceability, and basically prove to their customers that they're sourcing ethically, sustainably, and visibly. This is actually farmers in the Amazon, and the background, the red herringbone pattern, that's actually satellite data on the deforestation as it's happening in real time. And so this is a fully traceable supply chain that goes to retailers combined with an analytic view on where risks and audits need to happen. Okay. Now, there's a lot of complexity to turning these, which is how supply chains are managed today, into that visualization like the one I showed you. So half of what we've decided needs to be done is data mining, right? Stitching together flat files into a network model that's capable of understanding the complexity of relationships between hundreds and thousands of companies. The other side of it is engagement. Right? This is not going to happen through RFID and blockchain and everything having sensors everywhere. technology is probably the problem that led to supply chains being so disconnected. And the solution is actually that, right? Connecting people. So once we've mined an industry's data, we also know what they don't know. And our customers will then send invitations to those suppliers to say, hey, who do you work with? Where are you? Where's my stuff really being made? And so they'll start with a little map on top, and they'll end up with a bigger map on the bottom in a matter of days and weeks. And people will ask, why would suppliers tell you where they're buying stuff from? And the reason they do it is the same reason they tell their customers everything else that they have to tell them, is to sell them products. So this is becoming, this doesn't happen autonomously. This happens because it makes them look good. Just like when Robert was trying to make a menu with a map on it, and a supplier to a large brand like a Mars will gladly hand over GPS maps of the farmers if that means a longer, better deal. I'll skip over this one. Now, of course, it's not to say there's no consumer-facing data that's getting out there. In fact, this project with Imaflora in Brazil that I showed you that was mostly about virtually certifying supply chains for deforestation does have an app. The app is used on about 3 million products a day in retail stores, mostly in Rio de Janeiro and in São Paulo. And it does take consumers who scan that barcode down to the farm level and explains to them various issues. There is a real problem in transparency on supply chains, which is data overload. Right? Information overload is a real thing. In a way, that's kind of what the Apple ad was, right? Just want to have one point, it's the greenest laptop, even if it's not. And we've seen that because we've started to work with real supply chains, and it's true, you would not have enough time in the store to even scan one product and learn about everything it took to make it. This is a snapshot of a cell phone supply chain. Okay, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tiers down to the metal, and about 500 suppliers of finished goods. But there are some brands, I don't know if you've heard about this one, Fairphone. Yeah. This was actually a brand that said, okay, if people want a phone that's fair and traceable, we will crowdfund it and we will build it, and they did. And because they have that mandate from their customers, who are also their investors, they've had to map their supply chain. But this is really where you get to the impossibility of communicating this much data, and what's more, how expensive it is. Right? If you're a small company and you need to collect that much information about that many suppliers, what are you going to do? If you're a big company, it's fine. You can get all of your suppliers to fall in line. But if you're a small cell phone maker, really all you're going to get is the addresses of the people who send you stuff. So I want to stress that there's basically the trend has shifted completely, right, from an activist project, a research project, to a voluntary project, really a business process that helps operations run more smoothly. And that also means a lot of platforms have emerged that make this a much easier process, especially for brands that don't have the kind of market clout of a Mars. And what does that mean? Well, that's meant obviously the platforms that we make available for free for brands to map their supply chain. It's meant a diffusion of techniques, using barcodes and apps, and there's Chrome plugins you can use nowadays. It has meant real standards, and I'll go back to that one in a second, that have emerged across industries. Okay? So if you're a small apparel buyer or you're a small pharmaceutical company, you don't have to audit your whole supply chain to get visibility. You can actually join one of the many multi-stakeholder initiatives that are out there that are meant to basically pool the resources of an industry to map all of their common suppliers. And so one of the most powerful of these is the Sustainability Consortium that was spearheaded by Walmart. Another is the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. Okay, so these are the same idea, audit, sharing, pools. There's actually one that's widely used in pharmaceuticals called RX360. And the goal here is to not make every brand do the work themselves, but to have common standards, common requests for information, so that they can start to measure these emerging concerns like social practices, deforestation, fair trade. I mean, they can do that in a standard way. Nobody has to reinvent the wheel. So the Sustainable Apparel Coalition is one example. The other one that I want to talk about that just came out, and this is actually great because of the swipe and gripe, was at the beginning of this, and now at the end of this, there's actually a standard that's just been adopted by the entire Grocery Manufacturers Association called Smart Label. Are any of you familiar with it? No? Okay. Well, you're about to be. So even if you look at your Hershey's bar today, you'll see a little tiny QR code that says Smart Label on the bottom. Now this is in answer to all of those requests for information that consumers and governments have had of food companies for years. I'll just show you this very short little video.
Many of us want to know more than what fits on the package. With Smart Label, you just scan a QR code with your smartphone and instantly get the information you're looking for. From ingredients and nutrition facts to allergens and certifications, everything that goes into our products is at your fingertips. It even includes a glossary with simple definitions of familiar and not so familiar ingredients. And you can contact the company directly with questions or concerns. Smart Label will change the way you get information about products, from orange juice and laundry detergent to cat food. Companies across the country are adopting Smart Label as a new way of sharing more about their products. From simple ingredients to responsible sourcing, we want to provide the information you're looking for. With Smart Label, we've put the power in your hands to make the choices that matter to you.
So that's, that's essentially the arc of supply chain transparency in retail, which is to say it starts as a force that couldn't be controlled of a Greenpeace campaign, and it ends up as a kind of a standard by an industry group. So I think there's a couple of lessons to be learned there, but primarily, so Smart Label was actually introduced by Hershey's, and now it's being used by Coca-Cola and General Mills, and gradually you'll see hundreds and thousands of products with all of this extra information, including the GMOs, inside this app, which is actually a standard web page. So what the industry has done in these cases is, on the one hand, they've created standards. On the other hand, they've also controlled what is transparency. So what does transparency look like? It's a very different thing between that swipe and gripe and the Greenpeace video and Smart Label and what you're seeing brands do to control the discussion. But basically the point of this is, transparency is here. It's here to stay. And if you're not familiar enough with your supply chain that you can control what information can be shown, you're just going to be caught in one of those scandals that we've seen time and time again leave brands so vulnerable. And on the other hand, if you jump ahead of the curve and you have the information, you have the relationships, and hell, you even have an app and a traceability barcode ready to go on your product packaging, you'll be well ahead of the curve, and it'll be other people who are scrambling to catch up to you. And so I really believe supply chain transparency has gone from a fringe to a competitive force in business, and I'd love to hear how you're doing it, or how you'd like to do it, or why or why not.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leo. So that's some great information and insights and ideas for people here. And we'd be pleased to hear, as Leo said, how you are doing it or what your thoughts are on this. We have a couple of questions and some time for them on Pigeonhole. So they're all being kind of voted on. As that's happening, Leo, is there anything out there that grabs you as one of those questions? We can go back to the main questions because they weren't voted on yet.
Is this the winner? How does the FDA work in this new environment? It's a good question. A lot of our work is compliance reporting for the FDA, and so and I think there was another question in there also about who are the biggest winners in the organization. And by and large, till now, purchasing drives this. Purchasing and compliance are the main drivers of supply chain visibility, and that's because they're concerned with being able to communicate to the board and being able to communicate to the FDA that they have a verifiable chain of custody. And that's for quality, that's for compliance. It's for a whole host of other reasons than the ones that I'm here to talk about. But they are basically, the way they figure in right now is on the receiving end. They have pushed for traceability in pharmaceuticals. There's a 10-year window during which that's being implemented. And companies have to start with this supply chain mapping process that we do to actually get ready for actual traceability for the FDA.
Okay. This is a similar question. Not so much a regulatory authority, but institutional investors. Are they considering this approach when they want to monitor and reward sustainability in the companies they're investing in?
I would say it's early days. Right now, you really have a bunch of brands, that, including some of the ones I showed, that are well ahead of the curve, and then the majority haven't started this kind of mapping and quantitative sustainability measurement from the whole supply chain. And so not yet. What we do see is supply chain mapping, again, not in marketing and communications, but in investment. It's to find out whether the company has a dependable source of supply of raw materials for its future goods. And so that kind of due diligence is being done by investors using supply chain mapping.
A question about business model, right? What is the business model for this, for you and for SourceMap?
Sure. Yeah, so we're a software company, and we sell this very specialized social network for supply chains to mostly brands and retailers, some manufacturers, and they deploy it and they install it, and we're a software as a service provider. So once we've gotten them set up with that social network, they run with it and use it across their supply chain.
I think we talked about winners and losers. Was that the same question?
I think so. Yeah.
So do we need to know where they buy their fertilizer or pesticides? How deep do you have to go?
It depends on how much cocoa you want. We do. We know where the fertilizers and pesticides come from because we've identified that without a steady source, smallholder farmers won't produce more product. So in fact, I mean, I think it's a competitive advantage, right? The more you know, the more you can improve conditions in those production areas. So it's not about how much you have to do. It's about how much ahead you can get. And in the case of fertilizer in cocoa, it's actually the key determining factor we've discovered to the shortage is the lack of access to credit and fertilizer and pesticides for farmers.
Let's see what else is up there. Any programs to educate the masses, us consumers, and how to use this to make better purchasing decisions?
I've stepped out of the judging portion of this because as the platform for data collection and analysis and reporting, we can't put our finger in the mix. And in fact, we don't see most of the data that flows through our servers. But I would say it's the brands. I mean, from our point of view, the brands have been the ones who've been educating. And I teach here and there a little class, but you'll see more and more companies, basically like the GMA example, I think is the best one, right? They're really curating that discussion about what you should expect to know about your food and then pushing it as a standard. And that's essentially what people are going to care about, is what they're being shown.
This is a relevant topic. Just explaining this and educating the general public.
Yes.
So we can make wise choices and assumptions about global commerce.
I wonder what that refers to. I can't. Jeez. Globalization is great. Yeah, I would say we're a little ways out of that. People have used the software to buy local and to show good arguments for investing locally, but by large majority, this is a global world. Every supply chain we work in is across many countries and languages and income gaps, and I really do believe there's something. This is totally off topic, but I think there's something really special about our global economy and the fact that your computer is made by 500,000 people is pretty incredible, because when you buy those products, you're effectively enabling income at a global scale like we've never had before. So from my point of view, I think these visualizations and these tools that connect can only underscore how much we all depend on each other for global trade and how much benefit there is to sending money far away sometimes. But it's up to all of you to make those arguments, I think, to your customers.
So this question, do you always need supplier engagement, or are you only looking at the company's data to generate the source map?
We don't. I mean, there's benefit to just making a company's data live in the cloud and visually compelling and understandable. And so for some customers, that's all we do. But for the majority, the real ROI comes from waking up in the morning and logging in and seeing 200 more suppliers than you knew you had on your dashboard and in your social network.
Question from pharma. Have you worked with big pharma? And what do you see as the potential barriers to entry? We talked a little bit about regulatory. But
Yeah, we work about a third in pharmaceuticals, and about 2.5 years ago, it became okay to start using the cloud to manage supply chain data. Before that, we were touch and go there for a second, but basically SOC compliance, all the sort of regulatory regimes that you see around financial websites have made it possible to use the cloud. Without the cloud, you really couldn't have this kind of collaboration happening at a global scale. So we've seen it in big pharma, biotech, where they have very complicated supply chains, but often very small companies have those big supply chains. And they have those regulatory requirements. So yes, we're in pharma. The tools and procedures are out there now to use this at a completely secure stage. And we see that as actually a growing trend, is that pharma will be one of the leaders in supply chain visibility because of the pretty onerous traceability requirements.
Okay. Here's a question about engagement. If you're trying to sell to a particular company, what does an engagement look like with you, and how would you help us articulate the problem and develop next steps?
Sure. Engagement has become kind of a boilerplate thing. We get friendly with IT and legal, and they give us a big pile of data. We map it, and immediately the management says, "Oh God, there's something very wrong with that map," and then we send out the invitations to those internal colleagues and those external suppliers that need to provide additional information, and they go from there. But usually it's believe it or not, it's a 6-week project to do the first sweep, and then it becomes an ongoing annual platform where the data collection happens usually at about a quarterly level from all the people involved.
I think this
Zero
last
votes.
was kind of covered in what you just said. But a little bit about how big your company is.
As a privately held company, we do not disclose, but we're happy to work with third-party auditors. I think that's how I'm supposed to answer that question.
Right. Okay.
Happy to talk offline.
Great. Okay, let's stop there. Thanks.